The Magicians by Lev Grossman, book review. So I've always had a bit of a soft spot for fantasy books, and so this one caught my interest. Plus, I don't know if you'll remember this, but when this book initially came out, it got a lot of very positive reviews. There were two reviews in particular that I read at the time that influenced me or made me very curious to check out this book. One was from the folks at the AV Club, which I'll link to in the description down below, and the other one was from Slate, which I'll also link to in the description down below. The author Lev Grossman was somebody I was vaguely familiar with, a little bit familiar with. He had been a writer for Time magazine for several years, and at one point I had a subscription to Time magazine and would read some of his articles. If memory serves, he did the profile on Mark Zuckerberg when Mark Zuckerberg was Time's Man of the Year. He writes well, his Time magazine articles. It was a well-written article. He was also famous, or infamous, for his being a big fan of The Watchmen, the comic book series by Alan Moore. In fact, he created a little bit of controversy, I don't know if anyone remembers this, in 2005, when he was responsible for including Watchmen on Time magazine's list of the greatest novels of all time. It was the only graphic novel on that list, and it was Les Grossman who inserted it there, and this created, one of those debates that these lists always do. And a number of people said, okay, fine, The Watchmen is a fine graphic novel, but it's not one of the best novels of all time. Was it all time or was it the 20th century? I don't remember. I'm going to have to relook that up. And then when the movie of Watchmen came out, Lev Grossman wrote a review on it, which I saw making the rounds on the internet, describing how much Watchmen had meant to him over the years and what a big fan of Watchmen he was and how great it was to see it all on the screen. Some people really admired that review, and some people thought he sounded like a fanboy who had gone a little bit overboard. So it was interesting to see that he had actually published his own book now after so many years of just being known as the fan. I saw this in the bookstore and was curious enough about it after having read all those positive reviews and after having taken somewhat of an interest in Lev Grossman's reviews over the years. So I picked the book up, and here I am with the review. If you don't know anything about this book, the basic premise is it's a takeoff on established fantasy series. The first half of the book is essentially a takeoff on the Harry Potter series, and the second half of the book is a takeoff on the Chronicles of Narnia series. Grossman is taking fantasy stories that we're already familiar with, but trying to retell them with a more pessimistic view of human nature. So obviously, right away, you can see the influence of The Watchmen here. It's no coincidence that this is written by a huge Watchmen fan. It's an interesting idea, but in my opinion, it fails in the execution. So I'm going to part way with all the other positive reviews of this book, and this is going to be a negative review of this book. So the challenges in writing a book like this is to try and bring in enough fresh ideas to justify retelling these familiar stories. Before he even gets to the twists, Grossman needs to spend a lot of time just recreating a setting analogous to Harry Potter and a world analogous to Narnia. This is very tiresome for the reader because we already know these stories. Then once all the boring setup work is done, then Grossman can begin to play with these worlds and take them in new directions. But by this point, the reader's patience is beginning to wear thin. And that can put a lot of pressure on the last third of the book to be more spectacular than it is. In my opinion, the small twists that Lev Grossman puts on the Harry Potter story does not justify 200 pages of retreaded material. So much of this book is similar to Harry Potter, which is intentional, I know. I mean, I get it. Grossman is deliberately trying to recreate the world of Harry Potter so that he can add in the twist to the material. But as I kept reading, I kept waiting for the big twist to come, and I kept getting disappointed. In his blurb for this book, Game of Thrones author George R.R. Martin wrote, "Hogwarts was never like this." But actually, Hogwarts was a lot like this. Just like Harry Potter, the main character comes from a family where he's largely ignored and unhappy at home. Albeit he's not being abused at home like Harry Potter was, but the same general idea. Just like Harry Potter, through magical means, he is taken to a mysterious magical school for magicians. Brackbills, the substitute Hogwarts school in this book, is clearly modeled on Hogwarts. Despite being located in upstate New York, the school is described as being Anglophone in style, which is meant to explain away all the carryovers from J.K. Rowling's books. Students board at the school and eat together in magical communal dining halls. Prefects are appointed among the student body to help keep order. The school grounds have all sorts of mysterious magical anomalies, just like the campus at Hogwarts. But while all the changing staircases and talking portraits seemed new and fresh when reading the Harry Potter books, it seemed boring and stale and derivative when reading about the magical campus of Brackbills in this book. The faculty at Brackbills are an eccentric bunch, similar to the eccentric faculty at Hogwarts. Although all of the professors help the students in the end, some of them seem to take pleasure in tormenting the students as well, just like Snape in the Harry Potter series. And just like in the Harry Potter series, the faculty will often refuse to be direct with the students and instead hint at things in cryptic manners. Instead of being divided up into houses, the students are divided up into academic disciplines, but these function pretty much the same way as the houses in Hogwarts. Just as in Hogwarts, the students don't choose their groups, but their groups are chosen for them, in this case after a series of magical tests. The disciplines compete against each other in the magical game Welters, which is obviously a takeoff on Quidditch. The main character, Quentin, shares several similarities with Harry Potter. Although his home life is not as abusive as Harry's, he does come from a home where he is largely ignored and relatively unhappy. And when the chance comes, he desperately seizes onto this magical school as a way out of his previous life. He's not the chosen one in the same way Harry is, but he shows signs of being special. He's one of only 2 students to be allowed to skip a year at school, and the school faculty have trouble assigning him a discipline because he's a special case. Just as Harry entered the world as just as Harry Potter entered into the magical world as a complete naive and had to be taught everything by his fellow students, so there are a couple of passages which indicate that Quentin's classmates somehow know much more about the magical world than he does. And in passages which feel extremely repetitive of Harry Potter, they educate him about things like dragons or the game of Welters, while simultaneously expressing amazement at his ignorance. The other major character in this book, Alice, is obviously very similar to Hermione from the Harry Potter books. But more than all that, the central premise, the big gag behind the Harry Potter books, was that magic was real, but it had to be meticulously studied at school in the same old boring way that you would learn chemistry or the mathematics timetable. The combination of the fantastical with the mundanity of school studies. In passages that I found very irritating, Lev Grossman spends a fair amount of time attempting to rekindle this same wonder at magical study for his own readers, as if nobody had read Harry Potter and this was a completely new concept. For example, quoting now from page 55, this wasn't Fillory. Note, Fillory is the stand-in for Narnia. So when you hear Fillory in these quotations, you can imagine Narnia. This wasn't Fillory. In each of the Fillory novels, one or two of the Chatwin children were always taken under the wing of a kindly Fillorian mentor who taught them a skill or a craft. In The World in the Walls, Martin becomes a master horseman, and Helen trains as a kind of forest scout. In The Flying Forest, Rupert becomes a deadly archer. In A Secret Sea, Fiona trains with a master fencer, and so on. The process of learning is a non-stop orgy of wonderment. So that's talking about the fictional Fillory books, which are books within The Magician. But he goes on to say, learning magic was nothing like that. It turned out to be about as tedious as it was possible for the subject of powerful and mysterious supernatural forces to be. The same way a verb has to agree with its subject, it turned out even the simplest spell had to be modified and tweaked and inflected to agree with the time of day, the phase of the moon, the intention and purpose and precise circumstance of its casting, and 100 other factors, all of which were tabulated in volumes of tables and charts and diagrams, printed in microscopic jewel type on huge yellowing elephant folio pages. And half of each page was taken up with footnotes, listing the exceptions and irregularities and special cases, all of which had to be committed to memory. Magic was a lot wonkier than Quentin thought it would be. That's from page 55, but actually there are a lot of similar passages in the book Magicians in which it talks about how hard it was to study magic. Now several times when reading this, I said to myself, oh, come on, I've already read this. This is Harry Potter all over again. I get it. Magic is a subject that you have to study in school, just like any other subject. I've read this already. Now, in the later Harry Potter books, the tone does get a bit darker. The happy, carefree place of Hogwarts is invaded by dark magicians, and J.K. Rowling even goes as far as to kill off some of the teenage characters to heighten the drama. Lev Grossman is doing the same thing in his book, and I think this is supposed to be one of the dark twists that this novel is supposedly adding to the Harry Potter world. But this isn't a new dark twist. This is straight out of the Harry Potter playbook. J.K. Rowling did the same thing. Now, in the Harry Potter world, J.K. Rowling would never kill off a teenage character without first making you care about that character. Cedric Diggory is the obvious example that comes to mind. Grossman, on the other hand, shamelessly kills off a character we barely know, who was only introduced a few pages beforehand, and obviously only exists in this novel for the purposes of being killed off. He then tries in the pages afterwards to extract some sort of pathos from her death. But of course it completely falls flat because we never got to care about this character in the first place. Also, it's dangerous for a new novelist to force a comparison with an established novelist, which is exactly what Grossman is doing here. He's forcing us to compare him to J.K. Rowling. And it's unfortunate because he suffers from this comparison. Now, the Harry Potter series had its faults, I know. But for all its faults, one of the great things about J.K. Rowling was the way that she just got out of the way and let the characters talk. In other words, there weren't a lot of heavy descriptive passages describing the personality of the characters. The characters' personality just came out in the way that they talked and what they did. And as a consequence, I thought that J.K. Rowling's better characters, like Ron and Hermione, really felt like real people. Now, this admittedly was not true of all of the Harry Potter characters. Malfoy was one-dimensional. And he was one-dimensional in book 1, and he was one-dimensional in book 7. He never developed any sort of dimensions. But he could still pop up off the page. When you're reading the books, you can picture in your head every snarl and snide remark that he's making. By contrast, the heavy hand of the narrator is very present in The Magicians. The characters get very little dialogue, and what little personality they do have is often just told to us directly by the narrator. And I'll give you a particularly egregious example of that. This is from pages 232 to 233. But there are other passages like this throughout the book where the narrator is directly just telling us this is what the character is like. So quoting now from page 232. Richard, of course, was the mysterious stranger who turned up with the other former physical kids on graduation day. He was a one-time physical kid, too, of the generation that preceded Elliot and Josh and Janet. And of them all, he was the only one who had actually entered the world of respectable professional wizardry. Richard was tall, with a big head, dark hair, square shoulders, and a big square chin. He was handsome in a Frankensteinian way. He was friendly enough to Quentin. Firm handshake, lots of eye contact with his big dark eyes. In conversation, he liked to address Quentin directly as Quentin a lot, which made him feel kind of like they were having a job interview. Richard was employed by the trust that managed the collective financial assets of the magical community, which were vast. He was, in a quiet way, an observant Christian. They were rare among magicians. Quentin tried to like Richard, since everybody else did, and it would just be simpler. But he was so damn earnest. He wasn't stupid, but he completely lacked any sense of humor. Jokes derailed him so that the whole conversation had to stop while somebody, usually Janet, explained what everybody else was laughing at. And Richard knitted his thick Vulcan eyebrows in consternation at his companion's merely human foibles. And Janet, who could usually be counted on to ruthlessly flinch anybody who made the mistake of taking anything seriously, Janet waited on Richard hand and foot. It annoyed Quentin to think that she might look up to Richard, the same way he had once looked up to the older physical kids. He had the definite sense that Janet must have slept with Richard once or twice back at Brackbill's. It was entirely possible that they slept together once in a while now. So that's an example of the way the characters' personalities come through in this book. Namely, the narrator just tells us this is what the characters are like. As a consequence, many of these characters never came alive the way the Harry Potter characters do. You're told what personality each character is supposed to have, but you really only see a glimpse of it for yourself. All right. So, after all that, what twist does Grossman offer to justify this 200-page Harry Potter redux? Well, the language is coarser, for one thing. The word fuck makes the occasional appearance, although as I talked about actually in my review of the Harry Potter series, the Harry Potter characters go around saying F, like, oh, F, or what the effing, which is, according to the dictionary, an abbreviation for the word fuck. So, not much of a twist. And then there's the sex. The Harry Potter characters had plenty of romantic angst over the course of their 7 books. But although there was lots of snogging being, I believe, the British term for make-out sessions, sex was never an explicit part of Harry Potter's world. The characters in The Magicians, by contrast, are actively having adult sex. And occasionally things turn nasty. and one character will have sex with another as a sort of power play or revenge sex. So I guess that's sort of a twist, but even here, if you substitute in snogging for sex, this wasn't entirely alien to the Harry Potter world. Harry Potter characters would occasionally snog someone for the purpose of making someone else jealous. The other twist, the young adult angst, is also not entirely alien to the Harry Potter world. Harry Potter characters also have a fair amount of angst about growing up and finding their place in the world. That is, retread in The Magicians. What is, I think, slightly different is that Grossman adds the element of ennui here. That's ennui, the French word meaning boredom. The Harry Potter characters are always on a mission, so they never really sit around getting bored with their lives. Grossman's characters get bored despite having all the magical world at their fingertips. Or maybe they get bored because they have all the magic at their fingertips. They don't have to work for anything. And this, admittedly, this is kind of clever. I'll give the book this. The Harry Potter books, you got the sense that because you had magic, life would be just one fantastic thing after the other. The Magicians books make the case that because you have magic, there's no challenges in life, and consequently life just gets really boring, which, okay, I'll give it that. That is moderately clever. And so, just like spoiled rich kids everywhere, the Magicians turn to drugs and alcohol to escape their boredom, and this is definitely different than Harry Potter. So this is a twist, and it is new material, but it doesn't kick in until after the characters graduate. So you've got to get through 200 pages to get to it. And in my opinion, it's just not worth it. Reading about how the characters get bored and drink and do drugs. I'm not sure that was worth just kind of going through that Harry Potter story all over again. Then, after they're bored drinking and doing drugs, then the characters discover that they can escape to the magical land of Fillory. Now, Brackbills is the stand-in for Hogwarts. Fillory is the stand-in for Narnia. Now, this section is slightly more interesting, or at least it's better paced. Part of the reason for that is because Fillory has already been operating as a book within a book while you're reading Magicians. So the Magicians' characters have already been talking about Fillory and referencing Fillory. So we don't have to we don't have to start all the way at square one again with Fillory. The setup work is already done, which means we can just jump into the story a lot quicker. And then once they get into Fillory, then they go on a kind of Narnia-like quest or Narnia-like adventure. Now, the reviews I had read of this book had heavily hinted that there was like a very dark twist on the Narnia material. And that's part of the reason actually I kept with this book as long as I did, is because I really wanted to see what this dark twist would be. And I was so disappointed by how predictable it was. It was not like the dark, shocking twist I was expecting. So the first twist is that there is violence. Now, in C.S. Lewis's books, there is a lot of violence, or there's a lot of implied violence going on, but it's all kept clean because it's a 1950s children's book that was made by a Christian author. So all the violence is either off-screen, you know, there was a big battle, but it doesn't describe it graphically, or maybe the characters will clash swords, but there's no graphic depictions of, you know, somebody getting disemboweled with a sword. Now, obviously, in real life, if there are sword fights and massive battles, then there is going to be graphic violence and graphic wounds and stuff like that, which I imagine you probably figured out a long time ago, because you're a fully functioning adult now. And you realized a long time ago that the violence depicted in the C.S. Lewis books is entirely different than how a real sword fight battle would be in real life. Lev Grossman thinks that you haven't figured this out yet. So his big twist is that he's going to graphically describe these battles of magical creatures fighting each other. So you get giant anthropomorphic rabbits getting their necks violently broken. Foxmen get knives thrown into their eye sockets, etc. It's all quite graphically described. The next twist is the Chatwin Children. The Chatwin Children are the stand-in for the Pensivey Children from C.S. Lewis's book, right? Peter, Susan, Edmund, Lucy are reincarnated as the Chapman children. In this book, they're so maladjusted by being kings and princes in Fillory that they can't readjust to normal life once they leave Fillory. So it's interesting, and it is true, to the best of my memory, that the Narnia books never dealt with this. Like, what would it be like to be a king in Narnia one day and then just back to being an ordinary child being bullied at school the next day? I don't think C.S. Lewis ever dealt with it. But the Narnia movies, those movies that came out about 15 years ago, actually did deal with this. You remember in the beginning of Prince Caspian, that was one of the major parts of the movie about how they have a hard time readjusting to being normal children again after they had been kings in Narnia. So, I'm going to count this as a twist that's already been done. And if you want to say, well, but it wasn't done in the books, it was only done in the movies, that's fair enough. I respect that. That's a legitimate difference of opinion. I'm counting it as a twist that's already been done, though, because it was in the movies. So I thought, okay, this is boring. I already saw this in the Narnia movies. Then there's what's supposed to be a surprise twist at the end. But for my money, I saw this coming miles away. In fact, I thought it was so obvious that I thought he's not really going to do this. This is just too obvious. So he's going to act like he's setting it up for this, and then at the last minute there's going to be a different twist there. But no, it turns out that he went with what was the really obvious twist that was obvious to see coming at the end. Okay, so that's my review more or less. I'm going to get into some side notes here and maybe some spoilers. First side note is, after reading this, I checked the Amazon page for it. And actually, the Amazon review page, a lot of people have made or are making the same points that I've just made here. And a lot of people had made these points before me, in fact. Although I didn't realize that until after I'd written my original review. So it's apparent that I'm not the only one who noticed this, and I'm not the first person who complained about this. But that being said, it is obvious that this book does have its fans as well. And in fact, since I originally read it and since I originally wrote my original review, it's gone on to become a television series, which I've not watched, but I understand has been very well received. I guess this is a book maybe that has both its admirers and its detractors. It seemed to me when I was reading the professional reviews, like in the AV Club and Slate, it was all praising this book. But apparently some people do have problems with it as well. Okay, next, getting into some plot holes, spoilers, and miscellaneous. And I'm going to really get into spoilers in this section. There are a lot of plot holes in this book, and a lot of things that don't make sense. And I know, like, for a fantasy book, you shouldn't take it too seriously, but I do find this kind of ironic, because Lev Grossman, in some of his interviews, mentioned that he wanted to write these books because of some of the plot holes that he noticed in the Harry Potter books. But yeah, there are just so many things I thought didn't make sense. For example, first of all, this isn't so much a plot hole as it is maybe a narrative dead end, but what is the deal with Julia? Such a big deal was made of her in the beginning of the book, and then she ends up just being completely superfluous to the story. You could take her out of the story completely and not lose a thing. Now, I have read online that in the sequel she takes on an expanded role, so Fair enough, maybe. Maybe she's just getting set up for the sequels. Except, in interviews, Lev Grossman said that he initially wasn't planning on writing sequels for this book. I'm going to just assume that's a lie, actually. I'm going to assume he was always planning